Hello, my fellow Unreal engineers. Welcome to my channel. My name is Gregory Xavier, aka Mr. 3D. I'm an Unreal authorized instructor, a 3D technical animator, and a college professor. In this series, we're going to explore powerful methods for communicating between blueprints using blueprint interfaces and event dispatchers. These techniques will help you build scalable, flexible systems while avoiding the common pitfalls of overusing casting. The series is split up into 3 parts. In part 1, we'll cover the basics of blueprint interfaces, focusing on setting up communication between your UI, the player character, and actors. In part 2, we'll dive more into detecting interactions and chaining objects together. Finally, in part 3, we'll explore event dispatchers, which let objects broadcast and react to events dynamically. I've also included 2 versions of the project to help you follow along. The Begin project is where we'll be starting to build together, and the End project showcases the final communication system. The Final End project also has 3 extra levels in them that the Begin project doesn't. So test your luck, see how good you are. Whether you're looking to expand your knowledge of the Unreal Engine or simply create cleaner, more modular systems, this series is for you. Let's get started. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some concepts and use some analogies so that it helps you understand what we're doing in the walkthrough. When beginners open up the Unreal Engine and watch their first few tutorials, a lot of them utilize casting. Casting is a nice tool, but it needs to be utilized at the proper time. Unfortunately, casting itself is a very heavy process, and it's not needed as often as most people learn to use it. Here's my analogy of using a cast. You have a tool inside of a box. You open the box and you see an object. You then take that tool out and make a copy of it using resources and CPU power. You may not need to use the tool, but you most likely just need to know that the tool does in fact exist. You wasted resources grabbing it and creating a reference copy of it. That's what casting is like. Now here's my analogy of using an interface. You have a tool inside of a box. You know you don't need to use that tool. You just need to know if it exists. Interfaces allow the user to just open the box, look at the tool, confirm that it is the chosen tool, close the box, and then continue with whatever they need to do. There is no reference copy ever created, therefore never wasting any resources in doing so. In comparison, when people start using casting for every single little item, it's a bit overkill. Kinda like bringing a tank to a game of darts. Incredibly unnecessary. There is a bit more to understand about interfaces, and we'll get into that as we go along. Let's begin. The first thing we need to do is create the actual interface. So let's open up our context browser. Head over to the interfaces folder. It should be empty. Right-click anywhere and locate the blueprint section. In here, we'll be able to create our first blueprint interface. Select that, and we're going to name this one BPI_communication. Let's open that up. Thinking back to our analogy, this blueprint is essentially the eyes that allow us to peek inside the box, validate what's inside of it, pass any data through to it, and utilize any functions that we implement using this interface. Now, if the blueprint interface class acts as the eyes that are looking inside of other blueprints, we need to create the so-called hands that are able to do things and call things within the blueprints that this interface is attached to. To implement functionality, we utilize functions. The first function that we want to create in this class is one that passes a message from one blueprint to another. Let's call this one message to UI. And I like to put a little suffix in my interface functions. So I'm just going to put _if. This will help identify what the functions are and the events are later on. Once that's done, we're going to add an input for this. Click the little plus symbol in the bottom right. And let's rename this just to say message. Let's also change the data type from a Boolean to a text. In this interface, we're going to add another function. Click the Add button, select Function, and we're going to name this one perspective_if. We're going to use this one to tell different blueprints if we are in first person or third person perspective. We also need to add an input. Let's name that one first person, ? And change this data type from a text to a Boolean. We're done here. Hit compile, save, and close out the blueprint interface. Now that we have the interface created, we need to place the functions and function implements into the blueprints themselves that are going to be using them. Open your content browser, and let's head over to the very end of our chain here. We're going to work backwards for this example. So the interface we just created was all about passing text and data from any blueprint over to the user interface. And that's where the data is going to end up. So let's open the user interface. Here you see that we have interaction text. This will be passed to the graph as a variable, and we have an icon. Basically, the code that we're going to be utilizing is passing the text from an actor to replace this interaction text. So let's head over to our graph. In this blueprint and all the other blueprints, you'll see all the code that already exists. This stuff isn't going to be covered in this course, but feel free to play around with it, test it, and manipulate it as you wish. We're here just to focus on the communication part. So in order to utilize a blueprint interface, we need to attach it to a blueprint. So how do we do that? It's simple. We go into the class settings, locate the section that says interfaces, and in there we have a drop-down menu that says implemented interfaces. All you need to do is click the add drop-down, type in the interface we created. In this case, it's BPI_, and that's the only one that pops up. So click on BPI communication, and now you should see that we have interfaces as a new section under my blueprint. This allows us access to both the perspective and the message to UI functions that we've created. Within an interface, you have two main components. The first component is basically something that sends a notification to the desired interface. The second component receives that message and any data that's passed along with it, and then executes whatever code that it's attached to. As I said before, we're working backwards. So in this blueprint, we want to create the component that receives the message. Let's create our first receiver. Head over to the interfaces section, right-click on message to UIIF, and select implement event. This creates a new event. Since we already know what this is going to work with, let's move it into place and hook it up. Now, where does that message data go? First, it's going to be placed in here to check if it's empty or not. Then we need to set it to be the text if it's not empty. If it is empty, then it's going to hide everything in the user interface that has to do with the interaction text. We can do the same with the other function. Right-click on perspective_if, implement that event, move it into place, and hook it up. Now, both of these events are ready to be heard, receive data, and pass it along accordingly. Head over to compile, save your blueprint, and let's close our player user interface widget. Now, before we get to the objects themselves that have the data that need to be pushed along to the user interface, let's open up our content browser, head over to the blueprints folder, and then locate the HUDs folder. This is the blueprint that will be our intermediary. Let's open it up. Why might this be a good intermediary? Well, simply because this is where we're actually going to be creating the instance of that blueprint, the user interface, and we'll be adding it to the viewport here as well. But the really important part is that we created a reference to that user interface reference right here. So anytime we want to access this specific instance of the user interface, we can just come over to the HUD and utilize this variable. Since we have the direct reference, this gives us a very unique opportunity to talk about the different call types. Before we do that, let's add the interface and add the implementations. Awesome. Hopefully you implemented them correctly. If you need help with that, please refer to the previous section of how we implemented those interfaces in the user interface widget. Let's quickly talk about our analogy from earlier. We know that blueprint interfaces can attach to almost any other blueprint. We also know that they contain receivers, which we see on the screen right here. There's one more main component that we haven't talked about yet, and those are the systems to deliver the message to the receivers. Just like any custom event, we also have a call function for that event. So whenever this is executed in any line of code, it will fire off the logic of this event. Now, that's technically the same with these blueprint interfaces, except instead of only one version of the function, there are three. This is the part where a lot of people get confused because they don't understand the context of when to use each call function. Before I show you each function, we need to do a little setup. Let's head over to the components section and drag out a copy of our player user interface ref. I'm going to get that. For this example, we'll use the message to UI IF. Click and drag a pin out, and let's start typing in message to UI underscore IF. Here you can see we have three different functions. The first one is message to UI IF, message to UI IF, and message to UI IF. Again, this is where things can get confusing for people who don't understand how to use each one. Hopefully, by the end of this, you'll understand that. The first method of identifying which function to use should be very straightforward. When you drag out a reference and type in your function, you should see the available functions that you are able to call. Since I dragged out on an object, it's giving me all of the options. The second hint is in the sections of the context menu. The first one we see, message to UI IF, is in the call function. This one is isolated and used when you want to run the code of a specific object. The other two are under the BPI communication class section. This should be an indicator that tells you that these are going to communicate outside of this current blueprint. So the top one is communicating within this blueprint. These two are communicating with outside of this blueprint. Let me show you what all of these look like now. Here are all three functions. The first one you use when you need to call on an object of the specific class that implements the interface. The second one, you call on an object that implements this interface. The third one, you call on any object. Now, what does that all mean? It's a bit cryptic, but let me explain it to you in another analogy. Here's the scenario. You need to call a plumber. Now, the question is, what resources do you have and how do you use them to contact that plumber? The first way is using this function. This is an object call. In this scenario, you have the plumber's direct phone number saved under their name. You know exactly who they are and that they are a plumber. You call them directly. This function is for an interface call. In this scenario, you have a business card that says plumbing service. It doesn't have a person's name. You already trust that this card belongs to a plumber, so you dial the number on the card expecting plumbing help. But you're calling the plumber service rather than calling Sam the plumber directly. This last function you would use in a situation like this. You have a random number. You try calling it and asking for a plumber. If the person on the other end is a plumber, great. If not, they'll just say they can't help you. This one is more of a guess. Based on that analogy, in this specific scenario, we would use this function. Why? Because we have the direct reference to the object that we need to activate, aka Sam the plumber. Many times using event interfaces, you'll see most people using this. We will also use this later on, but for now, we know exactly which class we're referring to. So let's delete these two. If that analogy doesn't resonate with you now, maybe come back later and check it out again. But let's get back to work. So we have the message that we're sending to our widget blueprint. We just need to hook this up to here, hook the message there, and that's that. Additionally, down here, we want to call the same kind of function as we did up here, but we want to do it for the perspective IF function. So let's click and drag that out. We'll type in perspective underscore IF and choose the call function because, again, we know exactly where we're taking it. We know exactly where we're sending it to. Line that up, hook them up, and this should complete our blueprint. Let's go ahead, compile, save all, and close our HUD now. We have our message receivers all set up, so now let's send our first piece of data. Open up your content browser, head over to the Blueprints folder, and then the Pawns folder. You'll find the player character here. Let's open that up. Since we want to show and hide the reticle on the user interface, let's locate our perspective toggle section. This simply switches our character's perspective from first person to third person by pressing the IA perspective trigger. This is set inside of our data folder. We have IA perspective, which is right here. And if you want to take a look at the keys assigned to it, that should be in your input mapping context blueprint right here. As for the interface, we want to edit it inside of our perspective update UI and open it up. You'll see a blank macro inside. Now in this blueprint, we don't exactly have a reference to the HUD, so we're going to have to use a different method to get there. On the left, right click, and we're going to get the player controller. Out of the player controller, we can get the HUD. Now we have access to this HUD. So now off of this return value, we're going to call the perspective IF function. We only have access to the message, which is all we need. Let's hook this up to the output and also to the input. And now we just need to pass through some kind of data that will indicate if this is first person or not. Luckily, that's already been created for us right here. The isFirstPerson variable will tell us if we are in first person or not in first person. Drop that right there. And now our macro is all set up. Compile, save. We can close out that macro. And we can close out the player character. Awesome. Let's give it a little test. So when I press the Tab key, you should see a reticle appear when I go into first person, and again disappear when I go back into third person. In this project, there are only going to be 2 blueprints that utilize the blueprint interaction system to send text data to the player HUD. Those 2 are in the actors folder. They are the BP button and the BP door. Instead of calling the code directly inside of those buttons, I'd like to show you a shortcut that we can use now that we have access to all these function calls. Let's head over to the function libraries folder. If you've never used function libraries before, basically it's a set of functions that you can create and you can call them in almost any other blueprint. It's a universal library. Double-click on BFL Custom Functions and open it up. In here, you should already see one function that's put to use. This is a line trace. We want to create our own function. In the top left corner, click on the little plus symbol to add a new function. And let's name this function player trigger interaction text. Let's make some space and select our function because we need to make some inputs. The first input we need is going to be called player character check. And that type is just going to be an object. Make sure we're selecting the object reference. The second input we need is going to be a message. This is going to be of type text. Let's compile and save, and now we can focus on our code. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the object that we're taking in here is equal to the player character. So let's click and drag that out. Just type in 2 equal signs to get an equals operator. Then we're going to get the player character. Hook the return value of the player character into the equals operator and connect that to a branch. Next, we need to access that widget again. So we're going to get the player controller this time. Right click here, get player controller. Then out of the return value, we're going to get the HUD. And now we can send that message over to the user interface. Out of the return value, we're going to search for message to UI, and there we go. There's our function call. Hook this up to true because we want this to only fire when our object is equal to our player character. Then we want to hook this message into this message. I'll make some reroute nodes just so it's a little clearer. And that's that. That's all we have to do. Whenever we want to call this logic, all we have to do is call the player trigger interaction text in our graph anywhere. Let's compile and save. We can close out our functions, open up the context drawer, head back to our actors folder, and let's open up our button and our door. We'll start in the button. From here, things only get easier because we have our setup. In the button, we need to locate the begin overlap and end overlap collision boxes. Let's call that function that we just created. Right-click and open the context menu. Then we're going to search for player trigger interaction text. And there we go. There's our text. Now, instead of having all that code, we just need to hook this up and it should work automatically. Hook the other actor up to this because that's what it's detecting. The only thing we're missing is the message. So let's go ahead and make that. In our variables, click the plus symbol, and we're going to create a new variable called interaction message. Let's change that to be a text type, and also make it public by clicking this little eyeball symbol. Once we have that, we can drag this into our grid, get a reference to it, hook it up to the message, and let's set a default value for our interaction message. Before we can edit that, we need to compile a blueprint. Let's say press button. Once we're done with that, all we have to do now is duplicate this function and hook it up to our end overlap. If you recall from before, if we leave the message empty, it will send an empty message to the user interface and just simply turn off the text and the icon completely. Let's go ahead and test it out. Compile, save all, and let's hit play. When we take control over character, once we collide with this, we should get that message. And there it is. When we leave, it should be erased and disappear. The next part should be a breeze. Let's set the text for the door now. Open your content browser, find BP door, and open it up. Before we do anything, we need another variable. Let's name this variable interaction message again, and set it to a text type. Now, we're looking at some fragmented code here, but we're going to come back to that later. Let's zoom out and locate the block where it talks about our collision, right over here. Before we do anything, let's set the interaction message to something when the door is locked and unlocked. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and we're going to get the interaction message up here and just say, the door is locked if the door is locked. Let's duplicate that and say that the door is unlocked. Hook true into the first one and false into the second one. Now we should be ready to call our function. To the right of this, let's find our function. Player trigger, interaction text. Select that again, and we're going to hook both of these up to this. We do need to know which other actor is triggering this, so we'll hook that up to the other actor here. Make some reroute nodes. But we also need our message, so let's go ahead and add that. We'll bring our interaction message over here, plug it into the message, and once that's all set up, now we can move to the end overlap event. All we need to do is duplicate this, place it right here, hook that up, and continue the chain. This should take care of this entire interaction. Before we test, I just want to show you how the door works a little bit. If I select a door, I can take a look in the details panel to see if it's locked or unlocked in the default section of the variables that I've created. By default, the door on the left is checked, so it's locked. The door on the right is unlocked. Now let's go playtest. First, let's check out the door on the left. It should be locked. And there it is. The door on the right should be unlocked. And there that is. Nice work. You've built the foundation of a light and clean communication system using a blueprint interface. In the next video, we'll continue by setting up an interface detection system and chaining logic between different actors. If you've got time, please explore the end project to get a sneak peek and reinforce what you've learned. See you in the next part.